Yeah, I did erase it. Sorry. Back. Okay. How y'all doing? It's girl Ruth. I'm sorry. I'm sabotage. I didn't say that. Okay. I waited, watching and listening for anything else in the murky gloom beyond the doorway. Nothing came. I wanted to close the door and block it again, but I didn't want to touch a single thing in the man's soul, and not out of respect for the rules. Besides, I couldn't spot any object heavy enough or that I could easily drag. Backing away without taking my eyes off the door, I slipped away into dreams. Let me see what time, how much minutes I, okay. When we arrived in the capital, the sun was just peeking over the mountains and setting rooftops alight. I've been to Chelan only a couple times, even though we lived a mere few hours away, had lived. I suppose I lived in the capital now. My mother had often made appearances with Hallen of court, the two of them on display like jewels for coveting. They had frequently stayed with others in the city or even at the palace, though on rare occasions they'd allow guests of their own to come out to the villa, which was when I practiced soul walking on strangers. Truly, though, my mother had kept me away from the court's eye, and now I was here, while Morin and Helen were dead. Despite the horrible circumstances, I couldn't help staring out the window in wonder. The city was made of sandstone and coral, like many of the villas outside of it, but it was built narrowly upward rather than spiraling outward. Hmm, interesting. Bronze domes gleamed against the white stones in every shape and size, waving in the air like coins at the bottom of a fountain. Most of the buildings had private center courtyards within their tall, pale walls and colorful tiled roofs, resting in a neat slope toward the mountains like pearly rows of teeth. The capital was in an easily defined position, in a niche where the central mountain range, Ranter's fingers, beseeched Ethiopia and met the sea at the southern tip of island continent. The port lay shimmering deep blue to the south, while rocky, forest-veined mountains rose raggedly behind the city to the northeast. The only easy access was from the west, the direction for which we've come. The sun fully crest the peaks as we wooved our way into the city, making the buildings glow in pink and orange. The bronze domes flared like torches, and the oceans glittered aquamarine. For a second, the view made me forget that everything about my arrival here was miserable. Just like the roads threading the countryside, the city was impeccable, well kept, and organized. It was no wonder to me that the king was loved and respected, especially by city folk. They were cared for by their king, and perhaps by the goddess who was bound to him. I could almost imagine the sensation of retinous presence that people had reported at the king's coronation. The very streets and its inhabitants seemed blessed. City folks were out and about, walking or riding horses, some in plain attire, others in rich finery, and still others hidden away in carriages as richly decorated as desserts. Even several horses had their manes and tails braided with silk, their harnesses hanging with shining discs of bronze, glittering in the morning light. The sun shortly grew strong and hot, explained the white and pastel silks and linens that dominated the streets, matching the city walls. I was used to the shape of the forest and the cool tiled halls of the villa, but in this baking heat, even I would have been tempted to forego the dark colors I preferred. Despite the warmth, many heads were covered. Women wore scarves for a number of reasons: to keep the beating sun off, and if they were de- devoid, devoted, out of respect for Hesera, who held her bright self during the day, although the moon goddess was often partially shrouded in night sky as well. Many argued it was her loose black hair that caught, curtain, curtain contained her pale face, as if as it was far more common for women to go without scarves in the evening unless they really didn't want a breeze to disturb their hair. I never bothered with them at the villa. Skin color varied like clothes, the bronze like Helons from the original inhabitants of the island, said to have been Ratna's first children, the darker, born like Nikias that may have come from one Nomadic sailors of the distant East, the deep black of our nearest neighbors from the green continent to the west, and the pale tones of the traders from far across the sea who stayed and since multiplied multitude multiple, resulting in the likes of me. Many peoples had throughout time arrived here to mingle and create opiums. Historically, since intermixing was seen as particularly blessed, since Tayin had dark brown skin, Tin, Heshira improperly white, and Retina, whether depicted as a babe in her parents' arms or a victorious woman, was somewhere in between, her hair and skin a rich light brown. Statues of all three, from human size to building height, stood among the population as remembrance of their favor. Interesting. Most recently, the foreign trade that the king had encouraged had resulted in the city's latest wave of prosperity, a blessing that felt much more tangible. So many bright people, so many new fashions. I feel proud for my homeland rise within me, and I turn from the carriage window to claim something to Nikia. Suddenly, as if cold water were splashed in my face, I remember who I was with and why I was here. I sat back in my seat and looked at my hands, ignoring the eyes of the sickly souled man across from me, which flicked in my direction far too often. I tried glaring and then a stare contest to get him to stop, but neither worked. I wished I had something to discreetly throw at him. Finally, the carriage rolled to a halt where we were on quarter a quieter cobbler lane, the stones pale cream and smooth under the wheels. A townhouse set elegantly alongside a cluster of equal large, lavish buildings. This was no doubt a neighborhood of business and culture, the homes of the wealthiest merchants and maybe even minor nobilities. For the first time, it occurred to me that my father might be higher in society than Martin and Helen. The two men inside with us peeled out. I caught Nikia's arm when she shifted and jerked my head at the man who'd been sitting across from me, now stretching his back in the morning light. He's a foul man, I muttered to her. Garish, she asked in surprise. She frowned but kept her voice as low as mine, her tone turning hard and deadly. Did he say something to you? Do something? No, of course. I couldn't explain what I've seen in his soul. It's just his eyes, a feeling I have. Be careful around him. He's sick. She blinked, looking at me oddly. A rage girl she barely knew, warning her a grown and heavily armed woman to be careful of one of her own men. For a second I thought she might laugh at me, but then she nodded and slid out of the carriage, extending a hand afterward to help me down. The men headed through a narrow alley that ran along one side of the house toward a back service entrance, but Nikhil escorted me up the main walkway. I found myself standing in front of the new door, sky blue to match the roof tiles several stories above us, trimmed and glided wood set in the white sandstone walls. It should have been far less intimidating than the black door, but it wasn't. Nakia took a deep breath and shot me in an uncharacteristically nervous glance. Just be patient with him and remember that he did something. He did send us to find you last night. The very moment a message arrived from your mother. He cares. Which definitely didn't make me feel better. I wanted to hold back, assist, slipping quietly instead of march right in the front, sneak around like I would at the soul, but she didn't wait. Open the door for me to step inside. Surprising monsters. Whoa. The interior of the townhouse was cool and dim, with sunlight flattering through thick shuttered windows and gazing curtains. The floors were polished dark hardwood, ancient with pale, in intricately woven rugs. The upholstery of the furniture was equally rich, but reserved, with creams and dark browns set against each other in cons- constrained geometrical patterns. The golden statue of Tan lured over a small alcove, his hair like sunbeams and his gaze stern. The whole place was dark and light, benevolent and heavy, opposites holding each other in check with strict, refined order. Every surface was impeccable, clean. A man appeared at the top of the sweeping set of dark stairs. He was dressed in a fine linen suit in shades of cream trimmed with white, a pale blue silk sash at the waist. His airy attire in contrast to his severe expression. He stared at us, at me. Rather, indeed, he had my nose. Sir, Nakia said, bowing, this is Kamar, this is Sir Jaros, His Royal Majesty's esteemed head of tax collection, and the Lord of Numa family estate in the Rasha province. Rasha was well north of us, an island up against the mountain, even more arid without much of a wet season and cooler. They made wine up there, red grape wine, not white, pale wine, like down south. Superior wine, supposedly. I preferred pale wine. It was sweeter. Tax collector told me the rest. I suddenly remembered Hannah's rich tone of amusement at dinner a couple of years ago. The only thing tax collectors were good for is a punching their rear ends together and pennies out of the populace. Tight asses is what they are. I suddenly wondered if Helen had known who my father was and had been needling my mother. Based on the way she had laughed and shot him an exhausted glance, it was probable. As if Jardas could sense my thoughts, he looked down at me like I were some ragged piece of junk Nikhil was trying to hawk. I probably appeared no better than that, with the gown half torn away and my still red skin. I stared back at him, too overwhelmed for any real defiance. I did what I always did when unsure of my footing. I studied him. George Numa's skin was a touch darker than mine, a creamy tan. His eyes were an odd shade of blue, very unlike the brown of my mother's and mine. His hair was straighter too, and tied tightly behind his head with a ribbon. I could see why my mother might have liked the look of him. He was handsome, aside from the score on his face. Squaw, CROWL. All my mother's careful training in decorum and manners evaporated like a spray of water under the beating sun. I said. He wasn't bothered with niceties either. He stepped the rest of the way down the stairs and stood in front of me, his shiny leather shoes clinking on the hardwood floor. Sweet Heresha, she looks like her. Herod's eyes narrowed further, and like me, he said the latter like it might be a bad thing. Trust me, the feeling is mutual. I murmured. My voice was faint, so it took him a second to realize I might have been insulting him. Nakia cleared her throat in the awkward silence that followed. Sir, if I may be so bold, Camille had a rough night. This is your daughter, she said as if reminding him, and Morin's daughter. I interjected, angry, rising quickly. Good God, she even sounds like her. This was definitely a bad thing. He wasn't much taller than me, and yet he was speaking over my head as if I wasn't there. I tried to stand straighter, throw back my shoulders, but my ant bites shuffled under my bodice. Even so, I was about to say something in the haughtiest voice I could muster when his next words hit me like a punch to the stomach. Just so we're clear, Kamara is not my daughter, he said with a hard glance at Nikhil. Then he brushed me aside and headed for the interior of the house, still without saying a word to me. As my breath whooshed out, Nikhil's hissed in like she wanted to say something. When I glanced at her, her jaw was